I'm Robin Kwong. I'm Newsroom Innovation Chief at the Wall Street Journal and also one of the organizers of Hacks Hackers London. Absolutely delighted to be able to bring Mike and Jefferson Bob to Hacks Hackers London today, all the way from South Africa, as one of the advantages of our meetup going online and going virtual. Mike and Jefferson Bob are going to talk to us today about the Creative Storytelling Project, which was a project in South Africa that brought investigative journalists and their stories together with artists to create new works that would engage and draw in new audiences. So people who wouldn't normally go out and buy a newspaper, or actually people who wouldn't normally go and buy a ticket to a theater to see a show. Mike is a playwright and director in South Africa and a facilitator for a lot of the workshops that brought the artists and the journalists together, that workshop the pieces throughout the process. So he's going to talk to us about the Creative Storytelling Project overall. And then Jefferson Bob, who's one of the artist participants, is going to talk in greater detail about his piece, Usuli Ofalini, if I pronounce that correctly, Jefferson, which is a game show, actually, that is about, or that's based on an investigative story about land rights and real estate that were built on Black people's graves. So we'll have Q&A afterwards. Over to you, Mike and Jefferson Bob.
Right, thanks, Robin. I'm really sorry that you guys are not going to have drinks after the webinar. We would have loved to have joined you. We're in our 8th week of lockdown here in South Africa, and for some reason our authorities determined that no cigarettes and alcohol shall be sold during lockdown. So a lot of people are pretty dry and have been for the last number of weeks. So I think Robin has just about spelled out, you know, the project which I was asked to facilitate. So there's not over much more for me to say. And Jefferson really is going to be the star of this particular presentation. But essentially, the Open Society Foundation, Sue Valentine, who's here with us tonight, she can talk a little bit more about them as well. But they basically hosted this particular project prior to the elections that were held in South Africa in May 2019. The idea was to get stories that many people in our country might not have access to because they do not have access to the internet. So a lot of the investigative journalism that was being done, and with the stories kind of being shared on platforms like the Daily Maverick, New Frame, and others that are much more web-based. This was about trying to popularize those particular themes. And so we basically held a workshop at the Market Theatre, our country's premier theatre, in November of 2018, bringing together creatives and investigative journalists. The investigative journalists told their stories. It was basically like a speed dating session over 2 days, where investigative journalists and creators who had never really worked together before, they really did not even know each other prior to those 2 days. The investigative journalists shared their stories, the creatives kind of latched onto those that really resonated with them, and they then came back. The creatives did in January, so about 2 months later, having pitched particular stories that they were going to creatively interpret. And on the basis of that particular workshop, funds were made available for them to prepare shows. And out of that particular process, there were at least 5 plays that emerged, and they were all around the theme of corruption, related to various sectors within our society. So Jefferson's going to talk about corruption with regard to land, but there were also pieces around corruption within the police, corruption with regard to government departments that had, you know, basically sent off mentally challenged people from an institution to a whole bunch of NGOs that was completely not prepared for it. And those were the kinds of things that the creatives kind of picked up on. But as I say, my role is just to introduce Jefferson, and he'll talk a little bit more about the project which was really a game show, which I think will be quite an interesting thing for you to hear about. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Mike. And hello to everybody. My name is Jefferson Bob Tshabalala, and I'm an artist living and working in South Africa. And the project that I produced in partnership with the Open Society Foundation was called Usuli Ofalini. I love your pronunciation of it, Robin. Like, I think we're going with that one for the second iteration. So Usuli Ofalini essentially is a Nguni phrase, Zulu Xhosa, for dust to dust, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And that was following on the metaphor of Zanele Mji's article, which was titled "Those Graves Were Our Title Deeds." So the piece of investigative journalism that we were really drawn to, well, after that speed dating that Mike spoke about, I went back to discuss it with the team with whom I create these game shows, and I said, there's this really fascinating story that this amazing journalist has put together around how the Dainfern community, which is an affluent suburb in South Africa, Johannesburg, had removed people who were the original inhabitants of that landscape, and they had graves there, and they built mansions and estates on it, and they moved those people to a more impoverished part of that land district, an area called Diepsloot, which is a squatter camp or a squalor, and that's pretty much what we had as the story basing. What my team and I then do is we take an article that would come from a news site like Daily Maverick, which the majority of South Africans cannot access. So the accessing of theater in South Africa is also a difficult thing. So when we created game shows, it was about ensuring that we've got a format that is permeable to people who might not have a large archive of watching theater work. So we wanted to create an accessible format for the majority of particularly Black South Africans to engage with the material that we have, and also have a breaking of the fourth wall where we can discuss those issues or any of the content with the people directly and have them inform how the trajectory of the show is received and continues. So with my collaborators, Ritabile Mutavi, who's our director, Philip M. Dubutla, and Bule Welch, who are part of the sketch trio, we devised a game show wherein the story nuggets were made into an adaptation of township language. So we took the original article and then changed it into township language. And then we made sure that the sites that we visited around Gauteng were the areas that resemble the demographic of a Diepsloot. And the majority of those regions are also a stone's throw away from other suburbs, which are a Dainfern version. And that's how the geopolitical spacing is after the apartheid dispensation, where there is a affluent suburb here, and a few meters away from it, the workforce of that suburb is where it resides. And then there'll be another affluent suburb here, and then the workforce will be in a different area. So a 5-minute drive, the bread line really becomes super vast. And that's what we were interested in. So when we went to other areas, we would draw parallels with where the Dainfern of that region would be. But what really was super enriching and empowering for us was to see that before the stigma, when you say investigative journalism, people, it was a thing that people assumed you needed to have a certain level of education in order to be able to engage or deal with. But when we began to localize some of the lexicon, and when we began to use township discourse to approach the work, then you found out that people were actually interested in those stories. And people were actually contributing and engaging with those stories, and were sharing their own memoirs and their own understanding of that world. And we realized that the distance is not topic oriented, the distance is strictly literature oriented. So in regions where you're finding that the literacy rate is quite low, and people are finding English potentially as a fourth language, in a country that has got this diverse linguistic paradigm, then you realize that the reason people aren't engaging with some of these hard-hitting stories that could really have them have a different view on how they vote is strictly because they don't have access to them because of all the other social strata. So I found it very amazing that Zanele Mji was so generous with her article. She was so generous with her research material. She was generous with the videos that she had based her story on, with the recordings that she has based her story on. And then we, as the artists, had to find what we thought was important in the truths and in the fabrication of those truths. So in which parts do we also become the corruptors of the story in order to make sure that we can relay as much of it as we possibly can. And I think one of the things that we realized when we were collating our data from the people who had experienced the work is that each person knew who Zanele wrote about, because what we were giving people points for was, give us an example of who Lucky Mushumane would be. So Lucky Mushumane was the villain of our story, would be like, in your area, who is the villain of this nature? And people would know who that person is. And then we would say, Dane Fern, if you were to have it as an abstraction, what's the Dane Fern of your area? And people would tell us what that is. So by accessing their story, we were able to tell them our story. And I think I'm gonna hold it there for now.
Cool, thanks very much, Jefferson. I think I'm just gonna hand over to Robin for you to have a bit of a dialogue with Suzanne.
Cool, yeah, and to everyone on the session, please feel free to drop in any questions that you have into the chat, and I'll direct them to Mike or Sue or Jefferson. So joining us for the conversation part of this is Sue Valentine. She's the acting director of the program on independent journalism at the Open Societies Foundation. And like Jefferson was saying, was really a driving force in sort of conceiving and helping to fund and pulling all together this event. And I think I'll kick off in sort of asking a question around maybe start off with actually maybe a question for Mike and for Jefferson around sort of what were some of the tensions and some of the tricky things that you'd had to navigate in sort of bringing an artist and a journalist together to work on a piece, sort of where they're sort of, and how do you navigate this in the workshop?
Yeah, you know, we spent the first part of the workshop with people just getting to know each other. And so before people could really work together, they needed to be able to trust each other, but also just know each other as people. So the first part of the workshop was spent very much around that. And I think that during the course of certainly the afternoon on the first day, there was a lot of rapport, you know, between investigative journalists and the creatives. So I don't remember there being significant tensions. I mean, maybe Jefferson can speak more to that, but I don't remember there being significant tension between the creatives and the investigative journalists. I mean, I think there was one of the questions that we dealt with initially in the kind of discussions that we had was around who owns the final creative product. You know, this is the story that the journalist has written and researched, but the creative is going to interpret that story for his or her audience. Does the journalist then have a right to say, but that is not the story that I wrote, or does the creative kind of have license in terms of interpreting that story? And I think that was probably the major point of discussion. I don't think it was a tense discussion, but it was a really valuable discussion to have. And I think that most journalists basically accepted that the way in which their stories are interpreted would be absolutely fine, because that's what creatives do.
I'd be very inclined to agree with Mike, and absolutely in the countless exchanges with Zanele, it does come up, right? Because in our respective fields, truth is a completely different thing. My truth might be hinged on sentiment, and her truth might be hinged on a fact. And that fact might be irrelevant in my storytelling, and my sentiment might be irrelevant in her reporting. But I think once it happened for me as a click, like in the second workshop that we had done, a permutation in Cape Town, when it just dawned on me that everyone is practicing an art differently, and journalism, like playwriting, is storytelling, and we're just foregrounding different elements of what matters in a story at a certain time to get the story across as best as possible. So once we realize that the reason we're having quote unquote tension is so that we can best tell the story, it felt like a really good problem to have.
Thanks. And we've got a question from David Lush, who asks if the performances in the other townships, or sort of the performances of the pieces of journalism, then actually surfaced any more stories that the journalists could then dig into.
I don't know about that for Zanele, but I know about that for us. So I know for a fact that in our recording and in our recording of the responses, we were able to make subsequent game shows tailor-made for the regions we had gone to. So there was the project also allowed us a bit of a circuit return with other works to those regions. And for one of the regions, actually a commissioned work where people were like, oh, we came and we saw what you guys did with this. We would like to do some community outreach in this regard. And this is the story that we would like our community to know. Could you guys adapt your game show for this format? And we were able to do that. So it still felt for me like a continuation of the same project, just with a different story.
What was interesting about a lot of the projects was that there weren't traditional theatre pieces in the sense that they happened and then the audience kind of had paid money to see them, and then the audiences kind of just dissipated afterwards. In fact, all of them kind of happened in contexts where there was a discussion that followed with the audience. And so the work became a catalyst for much broader education and much more internalization of the kinds of issues that the pieces were raising. So it was actually fascinating to see that dimension of the work happening. And I personally, I mean, I work as a playwright as well. And I would like to see much more theatre like that, that instead of us just kind of presenting something to people like we the know-it-alls and, you know, take our wonderful words away with you, to really engage with people afterwards. I think that's the real way to do it in future.
Cool. And we have a question from Glenda Cooper from City University, who asks if Jefferson could talk a little bit more about artists becoming sort of corruptors of the story, and then also if you also engaged in a discussion with the audience afterwards. She'd like to hear a bit more about like what feedback did they give you and what did they say about the game show.
Well, so what happens when you are doing a game show where all people win are points is already you can tell that there are no stakes. Right, so our kind of we present a pretty flawed theatric argument, and we need to do quite a lot to make it have any kind of currency and carry for our audiences. So how we usually begin our shows is we ask trivia-based questions around the topicking of what our episode is based on. So, for instance, the story about those graves were our title deeds. We looked at the rituals of funerals in Southern Africa and South Africa, to be precise. So one of the things that Lucky Moshimane did was he used a lot of the money that was given to him by the housing estate and claimed that he had paid sangomas to do ancestral reburial and ancestral removal. Whereas really he pocketed the majority of that money, and what he reported was false. So in the township, what you would refer to that person as is a mashaya shaya or a shyster, right? And when that person is looked at in the story as a criminal, we can't propose to our audience that that person is a criminal because we don't want the legality to be the issue. We want the morality to be the issue. So we can't foreground that they broke a law or that they did something wrong, but we can say, based on these actions, what did you ascribe as a term to this person? Once the audience cares about the type of people, then we decide which facts are relevant to put forth so that they can follow the trajectory of the story. So only at the end does it matter that this was an immoral act, that this was an illegal act, that this was an act that's punishable by jail time. But at the beginning of the show, we can't head on and say, fact, this is what happens. Let's all feel terrible about it. We have to humanize and actually create parts where people celebrate, like Mushimane. He comes from an underprivileged community. He worked his way up. He built a business, and he started to employ more people. He employed people that were poor. He employed people that were in Diepsloot. The people who, when he got those millions, he got those people to also help with the ancestral removal. So this is someone who in the community could be viewed as a hero. And we needed to develop that kind of empathy. So the journalistic article will tell us immediately who Lucky Mashimane is, but won't give us his backstory so that we can develop a kind of empathy for him. So we have to corrupt those elements. We have to look at the other things around the story to make the ephemeralness of the performance a real thing. So that by the time we say this guy who's done all these wonderful things, when he heard this particular figure acted in this way. So in one sense, you're going, I understand that that was a greed-driven action. Or I understand that there was a split moment where he had to make a decision and he became this kind of person. And this is the guy who does rallies, he does food parcel deliveries, he's got a stokvel for old grannies, and then only to find that he's funding all of these things with subsidiary funds that he's stolen. So now the Robin Hood complex makes the dynamic a little bit more interesting. And it makes the debate between the audience members more highly contested. And it makes the theatricality of the experience more engaging, such that you want to find out more about the story.
Great, thank you very much.